My name is Myrna Lee Badger Geiger, and I was born and raised in the Triangle District of Charleston, West Virginia, Kanawha County. And when I say born, I was born at home at my grandmother's house. In those days, a lot of mothers had their babies at home, and the doctor came to the house. Dr. Jones came and delivered me at my grandmother's house. I grew up on Donnelly Street, 304. Went to school down the street at Washington Elementary, and that is where that YMCA center is for daycare is. That's where the elementary school for us was housed. We lived in a neighborhood that was predominantly black. There were a few white families. There was a family on the corner of Young and Donnelly, and I think a few more in the block. Not very many. We sort of like kept to ourselves, but we didn't bother them and they didn't bother us. They seemed to be very comfortable being in the community. There was a family around the corner on McCormick Street. They had children, but they played to themselves and we played to ourselves. So, like I said, everything was very, very nice growing up. I enjoyed growing up in the Triangle. I didn't realize that until I got grown. And then I realized what I had. And so we had lots of neighbors that looked out for us. There were several ladies in the community that did not work. And they were elderly. Miss Neal lived next door to me. Miss Jefferson lived on the other side of us on Donnelly Street. And her husband, Mr. Jefferson, was a policeman. He drove the paddy wagon. That's what they called it in that day for the police department. And he also worked at the Ferguson Theater sometimes, but felt very safe. Always had somewhere to go if my mom was not at home. I never felt like I was unsafe. Of course, they looked after us, and we had respect for these ladies. I mean, there were times we didn't agree with what they said, but we never said anything back. We just did whatever they said. If they said, you sit here on the porch until your mom comes home, that's what we did. We had respect for each other in the community, and I think that's one of the things that we don't have a lot of today is respect, especially for our elders. Most of my friends lived in the Washington Manor. There were very few children on Donnelly Street. Let's see, Mooney and them lived down the street. The Graves kids, the Whirleys lived across the street. And Dolores Ann and Harold Palmer did. And that was probably about the only families that had children of my age. Now, the Jacksons lived in our block, but they were older because they were already in high school when I was in elementary school. But my father's family lived on Donnelly Street at the corner of Donnelly and Clendenin. And that was maybe about a block and a half away. It was on the other side of the school. So I'd go down there and visit. Spent most of the time going to church. Our church was on the corner of Court and Donnelly, Metropolitan. Of course, it's not there now. That's where the tennis court, the King tennis court, is now. Played a lot at Donnelly Street Playground. where the Minority Eye Center is, down on the corner across from St. Francis Hospital. Of course, I also went in the manor and played with those children because they had a pool for us. Of course, later on, they did build a pool down at Donnelly Street, but that was when I was probably in high school, because I had a summer job there through Parks and Recreation in the summer. I worked as the cashier and locker attendant at the Donnelly Street swimming pool in the summer. Playgrounds were very important. If you didn't get, if your mom really wanted to really punish you, tell you couldn't go to the playground, because that's where all your friends were, and that's where you wanted to be. And so going to the playground was a big deal for all of us. They had a playground director, and normally playground directors were teachers. And especially in the summer. I mean, we had Mr. Homer Davis, and he was a teacher at Garnet High School, but he was the playground director down at Donnelly Street. We had Miss Kidd, Miss Burke, Miss Jefferson, and all these ladies taught. And we had them in school during the winter. And so, when we go to the playground in the summer, they already knew who we were. And most of the teachers knew your parents, because some of the teachers I had, Miss Diamond, Miss Norman, and teachers like it, my mother had. And so when you went to school, when you said your name was Badger, well, then they would run down, now which Badger do you belong to? So they had your number, so you didn't get away with too much, and they did not mind coming to your house. They would, if you misbehave, I can remember my uncle was in the 6th grade. Miss Della Brown brought him home by the hand when he was in the 6th grade. And oh gosh, that was not good for him when Miss Della Brown stepped through the door. So, the teachers we had, they were really, really concerned about us, and they wanted us to learn, and they did everything that they could to make sure that we learned and we towed the line. So it was segregated. There was a colored side and a white side. Although they were separated, because they had the red brick buildings, which separated both sides. They had fences in between the buildings. But the guys seemed to have gotten along better than the girls. The guys would jump the fence and they would go and play basketball with the guys on the other side, or they would come over on the colored side at that time. And they seemed to have gotten along together that way. Now, it was very hard for females. There was very little. And that was evident when I went to Charleston High. The guys were able to make friends very easy, simply because of sports, because they played basketball and football and red track and baseball, and most of them knew one another before they went because of being down in the Washington Manor. But as far as females at that time, we were not cheerleaders, we were not majorettes or none of that. So the guys seemed to have a better in making friends than, so as a female, we tended to stick with our own little group that we grew up with. I probably have a different view on integration, probably more than some of the others. I only went to Charleston High 2 years, so that meant 10 years I was in segregated schools. 56, fall of 56 is when I went to Charleston High. So I spent 1 year at Garnet and then 2 years at Charleston High. Like I said, we tended to stay within our own group. We didn't really mix in. I didn't have that very many white friends per se. Even though there were some in our neighborhood. I did not know them. I would see them, in passing, but I was uncomfortable, and to be perfectly honest, I didn't want to go. Tried very hard to talk my mother into letting me go to Douglas in Huntington because they were still segregated, and she said that was not happening. But I had some apprehensions. Never had a problem, just was uncomfortable, wasn't sure what to expect. Never was mistreated or anything. I know that when I was in my junior year for the junior class play, which really surprised me, I played the organ for my church. And so I was asked to do the music, and that really shocked me because I didn't have a clue that they even knew that I even played. So I was quite pleased. My mom was quite happy with that, but I did have two young ladies, Barbara McCracken and Barbara, what was her maiden name? Lukes, who befriended me. And we kept in touch even after we graduated from high school. And I know when I taught at Holtz, I had Barbara McCracken's son. And she came to parent conference because her name was Paolini, and I had no idea. And we looked at one another, and they said, "Don't we know one another?" And yes, so I had AJ, and then the other Barbara, she came to Holtz to teach, so we became, we were able to meet up again. So those two young ladies stand out as far as, and now there have been some others. I think when I went to Holtz to teach, I ran into a lot of people that were in my class. Bill Sale and Danny Wells and Herc Sims. I mean, those names came out, and when I looked at my yearbook, I'm saying, these people were in my class, and I didn't even know them. But now, but I had their children at Holtz, so we reminisced about that. When I go to church now, and I sit in our fellowship hall and look out the double doors, I can visualize our house, because that's where I lived. I lived right across the street from that where the King Center is now, is the block in which I lived. And of course, our church was down on the corner, and that's where the tennis court is, And as I told you, our elementary school is where the Y daycare center is now. I'm trying to think. There's probably, of course now, Minority Eye Center is where the swimming pool and Donnelly Street Playground was on that corner across from the hospital. But I cannot think of anything that's still Of course, now that they've torn the manor down, see, it's even different. than what it was when I was growing up. The streets are there now. There's no more Dryden Street, and no more North Rand Street, no more Elk Street. And as I said, Bullitt Street exists now, but it's on the other side of the track where Fazio's is. But when I was growing up, it was off of Donnelly Street. Young Street was off of Donnelly, and it does not exist on that side of the tracks. But it does exist over on Habitat for Humanity is on the corner of Young Street. And of course, and I'm trying to think what was in. Now, we had an ice house that was over where that Habitat place is, but it was on the corner there. You know where the BB&T is? All right, diagonally across from there, I don't know what's there now. That used to be the North Pole Ice House, where people got their ice. Of course, now when I was little, the iceman came to your house. I mean, you had a card, and you had 25, 50, 75, and 100 on this card, and they had holes in it, and you'd hang it out. And when the iceman would come through your neighborhood, he'd look and see how many pounds of ice you want, and because we didn't lock the doors. And he would take the ice, and he would take it around the back and put it in your ice box, and people would leave the money on top of the ice box for the iceman. So then when he stopped coming, because he had a horse and a cart, and of course we would be running behind trying to get some chips of ice. Often when he'd have that ice pick, and he would, separate that huge block of ice into whatever size pounds of ice you wanted. But then, of course, when he stopped running, then, of course, people would go to the North Pole Ice House and get their ice. And then, of course, people got electric refrigerators and stuff like that. But I grew up with what they call an ice box. And it sat out in the back of the house on the porch, or if you had a pantry or whatever, where it was cold. And, it had one side had a long door, and then this side had a half door where you put the ice in, and kept your stuff cold, So, and of course, in the summer, we chip off of it. When you made your Kool-Aid or your lemonade for your meals, you had, and it was nothing like crunching on ice. I mean, growing up. So, and of course, we had men who came through selling vegetables, and stuff like that. The one thing that I really liked, it was clean. The streets were clean. There was no trash. The city had a gentleman, his name was Ernest, and he had a push cart and a broom. And he came and and if he swept up everything. And if you had anything you wanted, you could sit it out on the curb, and he would pick it up and put it, and, came every day and cleaned the streets. People took pride in their homes, kept their grass cut. They had flowers, hedges. I mean, it was just, was just a wonderful place to be. And even the people in the manor, I mean, Miss Kimbrough, she was the manager. Boy, she was something else. She ran a real tight ship. But even the people in the manor, their places were immaculate all of the time. All the courts, and even where they kept the trash cans, they were enclosed, and you just didn't see them. They had some kind of covering on them. But people would keep their property or wherever they rented clean. And like I said, most of the people rented in downtown Charleston in the Triangle. I know Miss Godley owned her house, and the Wanzers. Dr. Moore at Wanzer Lane, She was the music director and band leader at Garnet. For years. But she was also in charge of the music for those of us in segregated schools. And she would come around and, we would sing for her and she'd give the teachers, because, there was a set of people that were assigned to the segregated schools. Mr. Brown, H. Brown, who else was there? Mr. Preston, he's clean to Preston Funeral Home man. C.A. Preston, I think his name, Charles A. Preston. So we had our own educational people that were assigned just for the segregated schools. And I don't know if they had offices at 200 Elizabeth Street. I don't know. But I know they came and they visited our schools on a regular basis. In growing up, like I said, I lived about a block and a half from Court Street. Now, whatever happened in the red light district on Court Street stayed in the red light district. It very rarely spilled over into our neighborhood. Never. And I grew up when they still had call boxes on the pole down there. And we had Three Finger Brown, Slick Smith. Those were the policemen. There was another gentleman. And they walked the beat. And they were assigned to that end of Charleston, where they had the clubs and the bars. And like I said, to my knowledge, they stayed in their place. There were very few blacks that went out anywhere else. I have to tell you, in the 50s, it was the place to be for blacks. That's where people came. And I can remember they had these dances, concerts. Civic Coleman had these dances and concerts every 2 weeks down at the Municipal Auditorium. And, when I was real little, they brought in people like Nat King Cole, Sarah Vaughan, Ella Fitzgerald, those people. And, of course, those were people back in the 40s and stuff. And, of course, growing up, I couldn't wait till I got old enough to go. And by the time I was old enough, because my mother said, you're going to have to be 16. And when you go, guess who's going with you? And that's what happened. But when I got to go, I got to see, Jackie Wilson, and James Brown and the Coasters, and all that group of people. They came. And these were activities for us. But you had these other people who wanted to be there. And so they would come and they would sit for the concert, which was fine. But then after the concert, then you had a dance up on the stage. Well, they would want to go up on the stage, but then the police would put them off. They couldn't go on the stage, and so they would be escorted off. So, when I got 16, my mother, Rosa Bradford, Dr. Bradford's wife, and somebody else's mother, Phyllis Preston's mother's wife, took a bunch of us girls to our first concert at the Civic Center. At the Municipal Auditorium when we were 16, and they sat in the, out in the seats for the concert, and then we went up on the stage for the dance. But they stayed right there because it was always from 10 to 2. That's what it was. And so, and of course, it changed after, after integration started. They cut back on those things. But I know that in its heyday, it was the place to be. I know every 2 weeks, and they always had it every 2 weeks because that's when miners got paid. And people would come from, Montgomery, Paint Creek, Cabin Creek, all the other, up Hamilton Holler, they would come. So that Court Street would be jumping, you might say, back in the day. And like I said, what happened down on that end stayed on that end. I never had heard of anything coming up to our street. And of course, being a young child, we were not allowed after 5 o'clock to go to Court Street. I mean, we could go. Now, they had Court Street Pharmacy. Dr. Dickerson, he was the pharmacist there. Dr. Morris's office was on Court Street. Dr. Baskerville, who was a dentist, he had an office down on Court Street. And then Miss Juanita Brown had a beauty school. And it was the only beauty school when I was growing up for colored young ladies to learn how to do hair in the state of West Virginia. And they came from all over. And it was on Court Street. She had her classes upstairs over top of Abdellah's store, which was Court Street in North Rand. And then the girls that were attending her, and they lived up there because there were rooms and stuff, because she had that whole top floor. And then they did their practice down the street from Miss Eva's restaurant, which was on the left side. She had rented some other space where they practiced their hair. And my godmother was in schools learning how to do hair, so I was always a guinea pig. I was always her guinea pig, and until she got her license. But so we had a lot of business going on down there. I mean, there were lots of restaurants. Miss Eva had a restaurant. Sang had a restaurant. Sam Harder had a restaurant. Miss Dotson had a barbecue stand. Of course, we had the drugstore, Court Street Pharmacy. There was a pool hall that was on the corner of North Rand and Court, across from the pharmacy, Court Street Pharmacy. And then there were lots of beauty shops and barber shops. And we had a shoe shop. Coleman's had a Coleman's Cleaners. What else was down there? Trying to think of any other bit. There was a store, and I'm trying to think whose store that was on the corner of Christopher Street and Court Street, because at that time they called it Fry's Alley. There was a grocery store there, and there was a grocery store up on the corner of Dryden and Court. So, I mean, there were lots of black businesses in that area when I was growing up. The water company, okay. Okay, there was a place called, it was a salvage place called Silverstein's. It was in that area, and that's where you could take stuff and sell it, cans, pop bottles, anything like that. It was a salvage place because it was off of Dryden, because Dryden ran right there, and then that salvage place because the water company's on and they had the railroad track. It was just before the railroad track. Yeah. So, yeah. But now I don't. And I tell you what else I had down there. And it was on Dryden Street. Royal Crown Cola. had a plant on Dryden Street, right off of Court Street. You know where the ramp is where you get up on the interstate? It would be in that area because it would be before you got to Capitol Street, because at Capitol and Dryden was Baraski's, and they sold chickens on foot. And had rabbits and stuff like that. But yeah, Baraski's. But it was in that area where the ramp goes up on the interstate, was where Royal Clown Cola was, because let's see, there's still part of Egan Street there. So it was in that area, because who was on Egan Street? Cubitt Campbell had a funeral home there on Egan Street. It was a little short street. Preston's, when Preston first opened, Preston Funeral Home was over on Shrewsbury Street. And then they moved over to where they are, because they were called Preston and Lawson. And then they moved over to the corner across from Garnet. I went directly to State, and I graduated in '62, and I got a teaching degree, and I went to Cleveland. I thought it was time for me to spread my wings. My mother was not in favor of it. She was not happy. I was 21, and she told me I couldn't go. So she did agree to let me go if I would stay with my godmother, who was living in Cleveland. So I agreed. But now, I'd already signed a contract in January. She did not know, because I knew this was going to be hard for her. Her baby girl's leaving. And she just assumed when I graduated that I would be applying for a job here in Kanawha County. Well, that didn't happen. So I was in Cleveland 4 years. I returned in 1966 when I got married. I married Burley Geiger. So I came back. And I'll tell you, I was happy to come back. I missed Charleston. When I came back, it was all this uproar about housing and urban renewal and the interstate coming through. When we got married, we rented an apartment in the East End called the California Apartments. And they were rentals from Charleston National Bank. We lived there. Of course, we were looking for a house. In the meantime, it was very hard for blacks to find housing. And of course, my husband being the outspoken person that he was at that time, he was instrumental in the grassroots movement of fair housing. The first house we bought was on Circle Road in South Hills. Now, I was concerned about my mom. My mom and grandmother were still living on Darnley Street. And so, being renters, they received notification that the property was being sold. So they had to find a place to move to. Very little help was given in finding another location. And for some people, they had to take what they could find and get. And fortunately for my mom and grandmother, my mother worked for J.W. Sears and Sears Monument Company. And he had a house. And he told my mom and grandmother that they were welcome to move into that house. And it was up on Walnut Road, up on South Hills. Now, Now, people were moving into housing that had been vacated by people like us. So when we moved out of our house, I'm not sure what the timeline was on the demolition, but someone else moved into our house for a short period of time until they could find something that they could move into. So when we moved out of our house, my brother-in-law, Harry, moved into our house on Donnelly Street, and he lived there at least a couple of years before he finally had to move. But the big thing was people were struggling and scrambling for housing, and there was nothing available, and they really didn't get a lot of support and help in finding housing. And that was a big, big issue for the blacks in the Triangle area. I think there was a lot of confusion going on, with people not knowing where they were going to be able to go, not knowing who to go to get some assistance or help in finding a place. I mean, it seems like they were just said, okay, you have to move and you have to find a place to go. And that was the end of it. And so they were sort of like left hanging somewhat, and I'm sure some of the people probably moved to places maybe they didn't really want to go, but they didn't have any choice in where they could go. There were some families, and they were families that were related, that went together, to do things like this. I think that was when, Geiger was concerned, that everybody wasn't able to buy a house or do what they needed to do to find decent housing. And of course, he started, talking to, I think his name was Bishop Campbell, who he worked with on this fair housing thing, as well as the NAACP, and there was another gentleman that was involved in this. I can't think of his name right now. And they met quite frequently, like 2 or 3 times a week at night, when people were off from work, to plan strategies. And I know they had a couple of marches down Capitol, because that was when Capitol Street was still. They had a couple of marches down Capitol Street. I know they had a couple of rallies at the Donnelly Street playground on the blacktop, and invited people to come and talk to the residents to find out what they needed or what they could get from them, So, but I know that end of the year when they put in that thing about New Year's resolutions in the newspaper, I know one of the things was that somebody had written they hoped Burley Geiger found a house to live in, which we had already moved. But like I said, my mom and them were still down there, so we were still concerned about them and what would happen to them. And I had friends that lived down there, because now it didn't bother the manor at this time. It did not bother the manor. It was just, the houses that the rental property that people had that were bothered. I would say it probably was at the top of the list. I mean, everybody, when I was growing up, everybody went to church. We had 2 churches right there in the community. We had Metropolitan, and we had Young Street, which is now Shiloh. And of course, some people went up to First Baptist, but most of the people downtown went to either Metropolitan or Shiloh. And both of those churches had been in the community for years. My grandmother went to Metropolitan when it started as a tent, because back in the day, the only church they had was First Baptist, and it was up on Washington Street where the post office is, and right down the street from where the post office is now. And Mordecai Johnson and all those people, that was, and there was no church in downtown in the Triangle District. And I remember Miss Matilda Parker donated the land that Metropolitan was built on, down on the corner of Donnelly and Court. And they started in a tent. My grandmother was 9 years old when she went there. And so that's been our family church. I was baptized there in 1951 when I was 10 years old. And I've been in Metropolitan all my life. And church was very important in our house. If you couldn't go to church, you didn't get to do anything. Amen. But sit in the corner in a chair somewhere and keep your mouth shut. You didn't say anything. So Sunday school and church were a must every Sunday. I don't care. I mean, winter, rain, snow, because we were just a block and a half from the church. And the churches worked together. I know in the summer, everybody had vacation Bible school. So, and I guess the ministers of Sunday school people got together. And so it was like you had vacation Bible school all summer. Because, Simpson would have one, and then theirs would end. First Baptist would have one. Metropolitan would have one. Young Street would have one. So we just moved from one vacation Bible school to the next all summer. So church was the most important thing in the community. And if you didn't go to church, you weren't a part of the group. One of the things is, most of the people who went to Metropolitan and went to Shiloh lived in the community. So once they had to move to Rand Institute, and all these other, and of course now the West Side had Ebenezer, so that was fine. But those who wanted to return to their home church, for some people it was difficult because they didn't always have transportation to get back to their home church. So you had people, and I guess this picking up people, bringing them to church from wherever it was that they lived. And I guess this probably was the beginning of having church vans. But in the beginning, people just brought people from Rand in their cars if they wanted to come from Metropolitan or from Institute. Like I said, church was very important, and they wanted to be there, and they wanted to be at their church. Even though they might live in Institute and their church was in Charleston, that's where they wanted to be. We had some people that transferred their membership to the churches that were close to them. Like, I know we had, but Levi had a church, and so some of our church members opted to go to that church because it was closer and they could get there, transportation. Same thing with the Institute, Ferguson. We had people that transferred to Ferguson. So for some congregations, it did affect numbers, as far as being able to get to churches. But those that lived within the downtown area or had transportation, they continued to drive in from wherever it was that they lived. I taught 45 years straight, and then I subbed 10 years after that, and I also tutored. When I retired in 2007, I could see the handwriting on the wall. Things were changing. Roles were changing. The role of parents was changing. The role of the children changed. It was like it was reversed for some reason. Parents seem to be more into their careers. Had a lot of kids going home to empty houses, which I never went home to. Never went home, really, to an empty house or had somewhere to go. They had a lot of latchkey kids. I see the role of the teacher has changed from a profession to a job. I also have seen the lack of respect. Now, I think that has played a major role in everything. The lack of respect for each other. And in some instances, lack of respect for themselves. I miss teaching. I still get calls to sub, but I said, can't do that. Too many changes. I have friends who cannot wait to get out. I mean, they are not quite as old as I am. Maybe they're about 10 years, but they've taken the fun out of teaching for me. It seems like I went to school to be a teacher, and I feel like these are mine. I know them probably better than the people at 200 Elizabeth Street. I need to have some say in what's going on with my kids. So they have taken away from teachers in the classroom, and school systems are dictating to the teacher what she needs to be doing. I have a hard time with that because they're not in there every day with these kids. They don't always know what's going down as far as what these kids are going through and don't have and need, so I think the pendulum has swung too far. And it's time to move it back. I think, I love technology, don't get me wrong, but it cannot take the place of a teacher. And too many teachers in the classroom are using it to teach. And I have a hard time with that. iPads and stuff. I think there's a place for them, but I don't think it should be replacing the teacher in the classroom. I've got to have that contact, feedback. Kids need to hear what other kids are thinking or questions being asked. When I did sub, there were only a few teachers whose rooms I would go into because I wanted somebody that was going to let me stand and interact with these kids and not say something for 5 minutes and say, get out your iPad. And so I made it perfectly clear if I was subbing, I want to do direct teaching. And the first time that this happened, and I told Bridget, I said, now, please write on the board, no iPads. Well, she put it on the board. Of course, kids didn't read it, which is typical of kids. So when I said, all right, put your iPads underneath, Miss Geiger, we need our iPads. What are we going to do? I said, just hold off. Well, we need to look up a word. And I said, guess what? You get to meet Daniel Webster today. Who is Daniel Webster? And I'm saying, oh, are we in big trouble? And I said, this is your lucky day. So, I knew then it was time for me to vacate because, using a dictionary, these kids are losing skills, basic skills that, they need. They need to know how to use a dictionary. I know you can do it on the computer and you can do it, but what if you don't have one? It's just like when you go to the store and the computer's not working, you can't get any business done. They can't count back money to you if it doesn't say $16.08. And don't give them paper money and the change. Drives them nuts. You've given me too much money. So been there, done that.